Hi, everyone. It's Shawn with Sagas with Shawn, Gods and Kings. I hope everybody enjoyed their weekends. In our last episode, we explored the divine ancestry of Harald Fairhair, the first king of a unified Norway. Using the first three chapters of Snorri Sturluson's work Heimskringla, we traced Harald's paternal line back to the Vanir gods Freyr and Njord. Then, using the saga of Ragnar Lothbrok, the tale of Ragnar's sons, the saga of the Volsungs, and Heimskringla again, we traced his maternal ancestry to the Allfather himself, Odin. Then, obviously, just to go back up to the top, we used Gylfaginning from Snorri's Prose Edda, yes, the same Snorri, to track Odin's descendancy through his father Bor and grandfather Buri, who, as you may recall from our last episode, was licked out of an ice block by the cosmic cow Athumla and was the first of the Aesir. But Harold was far from the only figure to claim divine descent. In fact, Odin's legacy stretches across myth and history, so much so that I've decided to split this exploration into two full episodes. It was initially supposed to be one, but this will now be a two-parter because I got carried away, as I am one to do. So part one, today's episode, will focus on Odin's mythical sons, the gods and figures from the actual mythology, including Thor, Balder, Hod, Vali, Vidar, Hermod, and some others that may surprise you. We'll explore their roles in the myths and how their actions drive the fate of the Norse cosmos, specifically their roles in the lead up to, events of, and aftermath of Ragnarok, in which they all seem to play a part. We'll also take a deep dive into some of Loki's children as well, who play a huge role in the twilight/death of the gods, aka Ragnarok. Then in part two, we will turn our attention to Odin's supposed historical descendants, kings and dynasties from Sweden, Denmark, Norway, England, and maybe even France, who all have a case to claim to be able to trace their bloodlines back to Odin. We'll also examine the humanized Odin as described by Snorri Sturluson and the Dark Age genealogies that tie him to Greek and biblical figures like Priam of Troy and Noah in the Bible. So in part one, we meet the divine children of the Allfather, and in part two, we see how this legacy was used to shape nations and this world's history. So as fellow fans of Norse mythology, or simply fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe may know, one of Odin's names, which according to the Poetic Edda poem Grimnismal he has many of, is the Allfather. So before we jump into the actual contents of today's episode, I'll leave you with Snorri's explanation of why Odin is the Allfather. In chapter 9 of the second portion of his Prose Edda, the aforementioned Gylfaginning, it says, "The sons of Bor were once walking along the seashore and found two trees. They lifted the logs and from them created people. The first son gave breath and life. The second, intelligence and movement. The third, form, speech, hearing, and sight. They gave them clothing and names. The man was called Ask, and the woman, Elm. From them came mankind." Then it goes on to talk about Odin. "His wife was called Frigg, Fjorgen's daughter, and from this family has come the kindred we call the family of the Aesir. They lived in old Asgard and the realms that belong to it. Each member of this family is divine. For these reasons, he can be referred to as the Allfather, since he is the father of all the gods and men, and of everything that has been accomplished by his power. Earth was his daughter, and his wife." Well, that last part escalated quickly, and I'm not sure how that physically worked out in conceiving their son Thor. But there is also an additional note I wanted to bring up because though Snorri does quote the poem Völuspá himself in giving us context on the creation myth, he does leave out a portion that contradicts his account of it being Odin and his brothers Vili and Ve who created the universe and people. Stanza 4 of Völuspá says, "But Odin and his brothers created the earth. It was they who made Midgard. The sun shone from the south upon the stones of their hall, and the land turned green with growing plant life." Then in stanza 18 it says, "They had no breath, no soul, no hair, no voice. They looked inhuman. Odin gave them breath. Honor gave them souls. Lath
gave them hair and human faces.
So Snorri did not mention the characters of Honar and Loth, or depending on the translation, Lod, Loder, and there's a few others, but he called them Vili and Ve. Now, I wanted to highlight this because many people believe that this quote, Loth, is actually Loki. And I honestly sort of go with that interpretation, despite the fact that Snorri decides to not mention this familial link. Some people believe that Odin and Loki in the myths are actual brothers, and there is evidence in other texts to support this. So if this is true, and Loki played a part with his quote, brother Odin in creating the cosmos, it makes the lead up to Ragnarok a much more compelling story than it already is, where the sons of brothers are in conflict with each other to spearhead the events of Ragnarok or try to prevent them. So in this episode, I'll not only list the mythical sons of Odin, but also Loki's offspring and their combined role in the lead up to, events of, and aftermath of Ragnarok. Note that there are a couple other stories that Snorri does mention where Odin, Honor, and Loki are on adventures together. So this bond is definitely there, even if Snorri used different figures as Odin's brothers. So anyway, let's get into it and discuss Odin's children in Norse mythology. Let's start with Odin's sons in the actual myths. And we will start with the most famous of these sons, thank you, Chris Hemsworth, Thor. Chapter 9 from Gylfaginning, and I'm simply continuing from my earlier quote, says,
Earth was his daughter and his wife. With her he had his first son, and this is Asa Thor, which means Thor of the Aesir. He has strength and might, and because of this he defeats all living creatures.
Now I know I joked about Odin being both the Earth's father and lover, and I guess the Earth would then be Thor's mother and sister. However, there's a way to think about it. Don't worry, not the conceiving Thor part, though maybe the graveyard scene in the movie Saltburn is what happened, but more so just the role that Odin played in the creation of the cosmos. We discussed his role in creating humanity, but prior to that, Odin played a role in creating everything else. Last week, I discussed how Odin's grandfather Buri was the first god. There was also the cow of Thumla, who licked the ice from Niflheim to set him free. Now I'll talk about another being who was there, and the first one actually, called Ymir, the first of the giants, who was the first to appear when the fires from Muspelheim started the process of melting the ice from Niflheim in what was the primordial void of nothingness called Ginnungagap, which freed the giant. So both Ymir and Buri were freed from the ice. When Odin and his brothers, Vili and Ve, or Loth/Loki and Honor, were alive, they killed the giant Ymir and created the cosmos from his corpse, as it says in chapter 7 of Gylfaginning.
The sons of Bor killed the giant Ymir, answered I. When he fell, so much blood gushed from his wounds that with it they drowned all the race of the frost giants, except for one who escaped with his household. His name was Noah, and his name was Bergelmir. He, together with his wife, climbed up onto his wooden box, and there together they kept themselves safe because Bergelmir is not an idiot like Kate Winslet was in the movie Titanic.
The Prose Edda as translated by Jesse Byack. Then in the next chapter, chapter 8, it says, "But how is Earth set in order?"
Well, it is circular, around the edge, and surrounding it lies the deep sea. On these ocean coasts, the sons of Bor gave land to the clans of the giants to live on. But further inland, they built a fortress wall around the world to protect against the hostility of the giants. As material for the wall, they used the eyelashes of the giant Ymir and called his stronghold Midgard. They took his brain and threw it up in the air, and from it they made the clouds.
Additionally, in the Poetic Edda poem Grimnismal, Odin states,
"The earth was formed from Ymir's flesh, and the sea from his blood, the rocks from his bones, and the trees from his hair, and the sky from his skull. The happy gods formed Midgard for humans from Ymir's eyelashes. They formed all the grim clouds from his brains."
Lastly, in the third section of the Prose Edda, Skadskaparmal, a version of the god Bragi tells a version of the god Aegir more about the Norse myths, and also how to name certain things using kennings, which is essentially using other identifying or descriptive language to describe something as opposed to simply saying what it is. A common, well-known kenning is couch potato, in which we use it to describe a lazy person. Keep in mind that a lazy person is not a literal couch or a potato, if it wasn't obvious, but it certainly is another descriptive way to label somebody as being lazy. Snorri gives instructions on using kennings to give names to describe a god or a thing or a force of nature. We'll dive into a few of these this episode, but for now I'll discuss the earth. As it says in Skadskaparmal, Aegir asks Bragi, "How should the earth be referred to?" Bragi answers, "Call it the flesh of Ymir, the mother of Thor, the daughter of Onar, the bride of Odin, the rival concubine of Frigg, Rind, and Gunlod, the mother-in-law of Sif, the floor or footing of the hall of the winds, the sea trodden on by animals, the daughter of night or the sister of odd and day." So I guess Odin being the mother of the earth could just be that he is her creator. So to get back to what I was saying, I guess Odin being the mother of the earth could be just that he is her creator and not her biological father on top of her lover slash wife. Reminds me of the character of Divith Fyr in Elder Scrolls 3 Morrowind. He is a 4,000-year-old dark elf wizard who creates his daughters and wives via cloning himself. Or maybe this more so reminds me of Craster from Game of Thrones and his keep beyond the wall of his wives and daughters. Also keep in mind that Odin forming the earth, who he had sexual relations with from the corpse of a primordial giant. You know what? Never mind. I'm going to go touch some grass. Moving on to chapter 22 of Gylfaginning, we discuss Balder. Keep in mind that the Norse myths in Gylfaginning are told through conversations between a king Gylfi disguised as Gangleri and High, just as High, and Third, all of which are aspects of Odin, not unlike the conversation between Bragi and Aegir in Skotskaparmal. The text says, "Then Gangleri said, 'I would like to hear more about the other Aesir.' High then said, 'Odin's second son is Balder, and there is much good to tell about him. He is the best, and all praise him. He is so beautiful and so bright that light shines from him. He is the wisest of the gods. He is also the most beautifully spoken and the most merciful.'" Notes that Balder's mother is Frigg, Odin's wife, and that in my subjective opinion, Balder is the third most influential god in Norse mythology behind Odin and Loki. However, not directly so through his own actions, just primarily because of his status and the perception of him to the other gods, as you heard in the quote, and also because of what happens to him. Keep in mind there are definitely others who it could be argued play a larger role. However, as I'll briefly discuss, Balder's death sort of serves as the catalyst to Ragnarok, which leads us to another son of Odin, Hod. Hod, like many of the gods, gets a whole chapter description. The bad news is that his chapter in Gylfaginning, chapter 28, is 3 sentences. So I'll read the whole damn thing. "Hod is the name of one of the gods. He is blind and immensely strong. The gods would have wished to avoid mentioning the name of this member of the Aesir because the work of his hands will long be remembered by gods and men." Well, that's pretty ominous. Anyway, Hod's mother isn't mentioned, though if I had to place a bet, Frigg would be his mother as well. Now let's move on to another son of Odin, Vidar, where chapter 29 of Gylfaginning says, "One is called Vidar. He is the silent god. He has a thick shoe and is nearly as strong as Thor. The gods rely on him in all difficulties." So Vidar is pretty cool because on top of this chapter description of him, he is present at Aegir's feast in the poem Lokasenna, where Loki drunkenly insults all the gods. He plays a pretty badass role at Ragnarok, while also not speaking at all for any of his appearances in the Norse myths, aka him being the silent. Also, Vidar's mother, Grid, actually shows up in a story in the third section of the Prose, Skadskaparmal. In this story, Thor is on his way to a rival named Garrett's hall and finds a night's rest at her house. As it says, "Thor came to stay with the giantess named Grid as a guest for the night. She was the mother of Vidar the Silent. She lent Thor a belt of strength and iron gloves which she owned. She also lent him her staff." So despite Thor often slaying giants and giants often fearing Thor, Grid had a familial connection with him and let him stay at her place during his journey to kill Garrod. Then in chapter 30, it discusses Odin's son Vali, where it says, "Ali or Vali is the name of one god.
a son of Odin and Rind. He is bold in battle and a fine shot.
So Vali plays a part in some major events involving his brothers that I will discuss shortly. Now, in chapter 49 of Gylfaginning, it introduces another son of Odin named Hermod. However, I'll need to give you additional context to some of my earlier notes before doing so. As I mentioned, Balder is the well-loved golden boy, and as for Hod, the gods are trying to forget his actions. I also mentioned Loki playing a huge part in the myths. So I'll give you a brief storyline of Loki. Note that he is not the son of Odin, and not per the MCU an adopted son of him either. Loki plays a few different roles in the myths. He initially plays the playful prankster and travel companion, but transitions into a fucking murderous psychopath, but for potentially okay reason to do so. Here's a brief recap of Loki in Norse myths, where he sort of serves as a helpful idiot slash prankster who actually provides a net benefit to the gods. We'll start off with the story where Loki cuts off Sif's hair as a prank. Sif is Thor's wife, then redeems himself by not only tricking some dwarves to give Sif a new golden head of hair, but gifts for all of the gods, like Thor's hammer Mjolnir, for example. Another story is that Loki, while captured by a giant who orchestrates the capture of Idun and her youth-giving apples, causing the gods to age, he gets them back and Idun back. Now, this one really wasn't entirely his fault because he was coerced to do so as he was captured as well. In another story, Loki serves a role in having his genitals tied to a goat to make the goddess Skadi laugh. The same Skadi who would eventually marry the Vanir god Njord we discussed in our previous episode. One time he did not do anything wrong, but put himself into danger, helping to disguise Thor in drag as a bride in an effort to get Thor's hammer back from a giant who stole it. You also simply see in many adventures that Loki is simply a sidekick of Thor as well, the story of Utgarda Loki being one of the main examples. He also makes a bad deal to the bereft of the gods that he needed to weasel, or in this case, force his way out of, due to the threats of the gods. As a result, the gods get their walls of Asgard built for nothing. Odin gets his eight-legged horse Sleipnir, and Thor gets to kill a giant. Note that Odin getting his horse was due to Loki changing himself into a female horse to distract a male horse who followed him away and got him pregnant. While this may sound humorous when discussing the myths, Loki being the mother of Odin's horse Sleipnir, it really is sort of horrible if you think about it, because Loki taking the disguise of a female horse to distract the male horse and doing so under the threat of the wrath of the gods sort of plays into the events of Loki becoming a psycho. But that is not the half of it. As we will see, when Loki's children, with a being known as Angerboda, who are prophesied to bring on Ragnarok, were born, things got a tad worse. Those children were Fenrir the wolf, who fought with the Hulk in Thor Ragnarok. Sorry, guys, that is not depicted in the myths. Hel, who was played by Kate Blanchett, and not the daughter of Odin, and the world serpent Jormungandr. The gods knew about the prophesied events of their deaths at Ragnarok. Odin heard about these events from his conversation with a dead seeress in the poetic Edda poem Völuspá. So the gods had an idea of what was coming and knew firsthand that Loki's children would lead to it. So the gods brought the three children before them, as it says in chapter 34 of Gylfaginning.
Then the Allfather sent the gods to seize the children and bring them to him. When they appeared before him, he threw the serpent Jormungandr into the deep sea that surrounds our lands. But the serpent grew so large that now, out in the middle of the ocean, it lies coiled around our lands, biting its tail. Hel he threw down into Niflheim and made her ruler over 9 worlds.
It then states that the people who die of disease or old age are sent to Hel, the land in Niflheim that is her namesake, and the dead who do not die in glorious battle go there. You then get a description of Hel before it discusses Fenrir, where it then states that the Aesir raised the wolf at home and it grew large, a little too large for their comfort. So they tricked Fenrir into agreeing to getting locked in fetters via sort of a, quote, dare that surely he would be able to escape the fetter for being such a strong wolf. However, they organized a special unbreakable fetter made by dwarves to ensure that Fenrir remained locked up. They also put a sword into his mouth, keeping his mouth open for good measure. Per Gylfaginning, the story does go much further. However, I will go into that further in other episodes. But one thing I find interesting here is that Loki's children really did not do anything wrong. Also, Fenrir in this chapter seems to have been not unentertained in this quote game with the gods. So the gods, at Odin's order, took action on Loki's children because he knew of their fates. However, the actions they did seem to take led directly to Loki's retaliation, and maybe they set the stage in motion of their demise for themselves at Ragnarok. So now Loki, pissed off at the treatment of his kids and the events that led to his pregnancy, decide to take action. Going back to chapter 49 of Gylfaginning, Loki tricks Hod, again Odin's blind son, to kill Balder, throwing a mistletoe at him. The gods, who just lost their golden boy, were obviously sad. But seeing as how we mentioned hell is a real place in this world, they wanted to send another son of Odin, the aforementioned Hermod, down to the underworld to get him. As the text states,
when the gods returned to their senses, Frigg asked who among the Aesir wished to gain all her love and favor by agreeing to ride to Hel to see if he could find Balder. He was to offer Hel a ransom if she would let Balder return to Asgard. Hermod the Bold, Odin's son, was the one who agreed to undertake the journey. They caught Odin's horse Sleipnir and led it forward. Hermod mounted and galloped off.
Now, before I continue, though it doesn't mention this in the Prose Edda, there is a poem in the Poetic Edda called Baldur's Drummer, which actually takes place before the events of Baldur's death, where Odin rides to Hel himself after having nightmares of Baldur's death to see if it was actually fated to happen, or to confirm it, because he already had an idea. He again awakens a dead Cirrus, who informs him the halls of Hel are preparing a celebration for Baldur's arrival, meaning he was going to die. She also tells him that Hod, his son, would be the one to do it. Odin then demands to know who would avenge Baldur, as it says in stanzas 10 and 11 in Baldur's Drummer.
Don't go silent, witch. I want to ask you one more, till I understand everything, and I want to know more. Who will avenge Hoth's crime? Who will put Baldur's killer on the funeral pyre? In the halls of the West, Rin will give birth to your son Vali. He will avenge Baldur when he is only 1 night old. He will neither comb his hair or wash his hands till he puts Baldur's killer on the funeral pyre. I was forced to speak. Now I return to silence.
So to sum it up, Odin's son Baldur is killed by Odin's son Hod, whose lover Rind gives birth to Odin's son Vali, who kills Odin's son Hod after only being a day old. And then Odin's son Hermod travels on the horse Sleipnir, who happens to be Loki's son, to a place ruled by Loki's daughter Hel in order to save the initial Odin's son who was killed. How fun. Now back to Hermod's quest. He gets to Hel, sees his brother Baldur, and Hel herself agrees to let Baldur go under one condition, that every living being cries for their beloved Baldur. They convince all beings in the universe to do so except for one, an old woman who is actually Loki in disguise. So Baldur stays in Hel, and Loki gets revenge for the treatment of his kids. It is also mentioned in Skotskapramál that Loki got drunk at the god Aegir's feast and insulted all the gods, which are depicted in full detail in the poem Lokasenna that I brought up previously. Loki does discuss killing Baldur directly to his mother Frigg. By the end, Loki was chased out of the hall, captured, and chained up until Ragnarok. I won't go into the full events of Ragnarok itself. That's going to be for another episode. But essentially, most of the gods die. Odin's son Vidar does avenge Odin himself by killing Fenrir in battle, and Odin's son Thor does kill Jormungandr, the world serpent. However, not before he is bitten and overcome with a deadly dose of venom, killing him as well. As it says in Völuspá stanza 54, and keep in mind this is the dead witch telling Odin of what will happen at Ragnarok as it hasn't happened yet.
Then Thor comes, Earth's son, Odin's son, to fight the Midgard serpent. The protector of Midgard will kill the serpent in his rage, but all humankind will die out of the world when Thor falls after only 9 steps, struck down by the venom of the honorless serpent.
So there is a rebirth after the events of Ragnarok, however. as it says in chapter 53 of Gylfaginning.
Vidar and Vali will survive, as neither the flood nor Surtur's fire destroyed them, and they will inhabit Edelvall, the place where Asgard was earlier. To there will come Thor's sons, Modi and Magni, and they will have Mjolnir with them. Next, Baldur and Hod will arrive from Hel.
So funny because the Prose never mentioned Hod dying and going there in the first place. And also funny because the banquet for Baldur must have been fun if Hod, his killer, was there as well. So now really quick, I wanted to note the stanza describing Thor's death where it says all of humankind will die out when Thor dies. Now what we know of the humans so far in the myths is that Ask and Embla were the first humans. Assuming that they died, then this can be explained in another quote detailing the aftermath of Ragnarok, where Thor will not return, but his sons and some of his brothers will. It says,
In the place called Hodmimir's Wood, two people will have hidden themselves from Surtur's fire, called Lif and Lifthrasr. They have the morning dew for food. From these will come so many descendants that the whole world will inhabit.
So there's also a quote in the poem Vafthrûthnismal that discusses these two humans. However, interesting because like Ask and Embla in the Norse world, you would say that they are also descended from Leif and Leifthraser. So anyway, per Gylfaginning, Odin has 6 sons, Thor, Baldur, Hod, Vali, Vidar, and Hermod. Their known mothers are the literal god personification of the earth, who is also the daughter/lover of Odin, Frigg, Rind, and Grid. However, we can now discuss some additional potentially mythical sons of Odin using the aforementioned Skadskaparmal, the section right after Gylfaginning in the Prose Edda. However, some of the additional sons of Odin here are weirdly not mentioned as being his kin in Gylfaginning, where Snorri often makes a point to highlight the blood relation to characters who are among each other. And we will see that there is conflicting information when comparing some of the poetic Edda poems as well, as we already discussed with Vili and Ve or Honar and Loki. So going to the kennings to describe other gods and there being the sons of Odin, this one being Heimdall. Note that Heimdall foresees the events of Ragnarok coming and blows the Galar horn to alert the Aesir for battle. The text states,
How should Heimdall be referred to? He can be called the son of 9 mothers, the watchman of the gods, Loki's foe. Another name for Heimdall is Vinsler. He can also be called the son of Odin.
So as far as I know, this is the only mention of Heimdall being bloodkin to Odin. Now note that one of the kennings also states that Heimdall is Loki's foe. This is because they fight each other at Ragnarok and are the, quote, deaths of each other. So Loki kills Heimdall and Heimdall kills Loki. I wanted to say this because this means that Heimdall, who also seems to be Odin's son, also plays a part in Ragnarok. He alerts the gods of its coming and fights in it and kills Loki. So another son of Odin played a huge part in the events leading up to and during Ragnarok. Also funny because Heimdall apparently has 9 mothers. So if Odin is his father, I also do not know how that conception worked. Now to another surprise son.
How should Tyr be referred to? Well, by calling him the one-handed god, the foster father of the wolf, the god of battles and the son of Odin.
Now another interesting son of Odin who played a part in the lead up to Ragnarok. He also played a part in Ragnarok as he fought the wolf Garm. And not unlike Loki/Heimdall, they killed each other during the battle of the Vigrid Fields. Tyr also played a big role in chaining of another wolf, the son of Loki, Fenrir, and his imprisonment at the hands of the Aesir that we discussed earlier. So when Fenrir was with the Aesir, the only member of the gods who was not afraid of him and could approach him to feed him was Tyr, maybe something to do with him being the, quote, foster father of the wolf, a kenning I just quoted. Now, when the Aesir wanted to trick Fenrir into being locked up by the dwarves' fetter, he initially didn't want to do it since he didn't trust them. However, as a sign of good faith, Tyr put his arm into Fenrir's mouth. When Fenrir was chained up and could not get out, he bit off Tyr's arm. So note another one of the kennings for Tyr is the, quote, one-handed god. Now, there is some contradictory information here as well, because in the poetic Edda poem Heimskviða, Tyr and Thor are on a mission to get a huge cauldron to brew beer for a party for the gods. And you have a run-in with Tyr's father, a giant named Hymir. In this story, there are events of Thor's fishing trip and catching his adversary Jormungandr, again a son of Loki as well. However, Snorri's account in the Prose Edda is sort of different, so he put his own spin on that story too. But I just wanted to make this note because Tyr's father is Hymir in that story and not Odin. Anyway, since Hymir was a giant, of course the story concludes with Thor killing him, which would have made for a fun journey home with Tyr. Now, an additional son of Odin is, funny enough, Bragi. Keep in mind that this is Bragi answering a question from Aegir. The text says, "How should Bragi be referred to?" Note that Aegir could have said, "What should I call you?" But Bragi says, "By calling him the husband of Idun, the first maker of poetry, the son of Odin, and the long-bearded god." In Lokasenna, again, where Loki insults the gods at a party hosted by, funny enough, Aegir, Loki makes a jab at the uselessness of Bragi and essentially calls him the equivalent of a seat filler at the Emmys. He also calls him a coward and initially singles him out in starting his insults in the first place. Anyway, that is it for the additional sons mentioned in Skadskaparmal. Though Snorri himself writes about their supposed kindred to Odin, I'm not sure how many Norse pagans or fans of Norse mythology really consider it canon. Or maybe they just go with the claim that everybody is the son/daughter of Odin due to him being the Allfather. Now, there is one more mythical god that I discussed last week, that being Yngvi, another name for Freyr. It is mentioned in the prologue of the Prose Edda. However, Snorri gives another contradictory account of this story in Ynglinga Saga, a similar story of the humanized versions of the gods living on Earth and settling in Scandinavia. This is not canon to me, Odin being Freyr's father, or more so my narrative with this podcast, since the myths say that Njord is Freyr's father, as does Ynglinga Saga, and not Odin. To close out part one, despite all of his wisdom, power, and foresight, Odin could not stop Ragnarok. The seers in Völuspá told him everything, how he would be devoured by Fenrir, only to be avenged by his son Vidar, how some of his sons and kin would fall, and how the world he helped shape would burn. And yet, since he tried to stop it, he tried to bind chaos in chaining Fenrir while banishing his potential niece and nephew Hel and Jormungandr to try to outmaneuver destiny itself. And in doing so, he may have directly ensured that very end, meaning his actions literally brought on what he was trying to stop. However, I like to think that Odin knew deep down he would not be able to escape his fate. After his conversation with the seers in Völuspá, he very well knew of his own mortality. However, he clung on to his sons and descendants, gods and humans, who would live, carrying on his own legacy. To me, that sounds deeply and profoundly human. We all know right now that we're going to die, but we will want to leave our offspring with a better world, and in doing so, carry on our legacies. This is one thing I like about Norse mythology, just how human the gods are. They certainly do not have high morals. And as we saw with binding Fenrir, the gods are quite cruel sometimes. They are not perfect or all-powerful, and they are grappling with their own mortality. Not unlike us humans, who may cling on to the idea that we can push back and delay the inevitable with, like, eating healthy. Now, I'm not saying don't try to be your best self while we are here through working out and trying to grow every day, by the way. So Odin and his brothers kill Ymir to create the cosmos. They also create humanity only to watch it burn. However, Odin knew the fate was for this world to live on without him. So why not set them up for glory? So in the scope of this podcast and connecting gods and kings, I like to think that Odin, knowing some of his mythical sons would live, also was driven to spawn his own bloodlines on Midgard/Earth, like we discussed last week with the Volsungs leading the Harald Fairhair, while also playing a part in the Yinglings despite not necessarily being blood kin to them. Now, this serves as a transition into our next episode, where we will go back to Midgard to discuss more of the, quote, historical sons of Odin, leading to more of the historical kingdoms that we know of. And with that episode, wrap up the discussion on the Allfather's legacy on this world. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.